So you've done a lot to kind of reshape the way youth ministries just think about other youth ministries. But for every pastor, priest, parent, vestry member, warden, the whole gambit, the real question everyone wants to know is, what does success look like?
It's a great question, and I think it always ends up on the plate of youth ministry. And I think one of the reasons for that is people kind of feel like youth ministry is an initiative that the church is paying for that isn't necessarily necessary. So it's like, well, what returns are we getting on this? Which in and of itself is unfortunate. And I think it sets youth ministry up in some ways to fail, because no one really thinks of that of Sunday worship. No one is like, well, what are we getting out of this? I mean, some people might say that, but for the most part, it's a given that this is going to happen. And it's interesting that we think of youth ministry in the sense of, well, what are our returns here? This is an investment, and what are our returns? Which is just a very funny way to think about our children. And we do, this is probably an overstatement, and maybe a church historian can correct me on this, but we may be at the first time in the history of the church where most people in the congregation think it is not their responsibility to pass on faith to their children. And by their, I mean, yes, their children in their biological or in their family, the family they live in, but also their children in the sense of, you're a member of this church and these are kids in this community, that we tend now to see it's the job of the youth worker, the job of the paid youth worker as professional to pass on faith to their children. And it's just a very odd place that the church is in, but it does lead to this kind of treadmill of success. Like, you are the professional that's paid to succeed, and we're supposed to see, 10% increase, and we haven't seen our 10% increase, so this is a problem. And it's something people ask me all the time. Well, how you make this push to sharing in each other's lives? Well, how do you judge if it's successful or not? And I do think our denominations and our churches need a different instrument. And I don't really know what that instrument is, to be completely honest. But I think in some sense it has to become an instrument based in narrative and story, and not in just hard numbers. And I think youth workers themselves, one of the things I would push us to really try to grow in many different frames, but is to become better storytellers. And in some sense, become better storytellers with young people themselves, telling our own story, telling their story, telling the faith story, and as these kind of interrelate and connect, but also do a better job of telling the story of what's happening in the ministry to the congregation itself. That one of the ways that people will go to the numbers, will go to technical rationality if we don't give them another rationale to make decisions on the ministry. And so we have to be able to tell people in the congregation stories about what's happening, of the things that their young people are wrestling with. And it's one thing for them to look at the numbers and say, well, you had 12 kids, now you have 9 kids. Shame on you, youth worker. It's another thing for them to hear about how, Amanda has been really struggling with an eating disorder. I mean, you have to be careful on how you share this information and disclose this information, but how there's been this incredible participation in each other's lives. There's been this incredible wrestling with the faith, and to tell those stories, I think, becomes really significant. So I would never want to make this about pure data, but the data that we use to evaluate our ministries, I think there's something essential about making sure that that's narrative. So we have to do a better job just being wise here as serpents, that we have to be able to articulate the story of the generative ministry that's going on in the youth ministry itself. And part of that is so people can evaluate it correctly, and part of it is because you're inviting the congregation in to share in it. And I think that becomes an incredibly significant piece. So I would ultimately want to judge the success of a ministry by the way we are each sharing in each other's lives. And that's somewhat contextual on how that is done, but it's really about the articulation of actually sharing in each other's lives, and not simply static or simply dynamic growth or exponential growth or something. It's not simply growth, but it's actually participating in each other's lives, which means that we have to tell stories about how that actually is occurring. And that becomes difficult, but I think it becomes incredibly important. So I don't have just do it this way, this is successful. But I think it's much more of a rich theological articulation to say success is what? Success is participating in each other's lives. Success is seeking for God. Success actually is Much like Mark 9, when Jesus asked the father who is in utter despair, how long? I mean, there's the beautiful story of Mark 9, that you have this father whose son is at utterly lost. And he brings him to the disciples, and Jesus isn't there. Jesus is actually on vacation up in the mountain. The transfiguration is occurring. And you can just imagine his despair that he walks all this way or travels all this way, and Jesus is on vacation. Give me a break. The disciples try to heal the boy. It doesn't happen. And then Jesus finally shows up on the scene, asks what's occurred. The demon couldn't be cast out, has some harsh words to say to his disciples. And then he says to the father, how long? How long has your son been like this? Which is really the invitation to share his story, and for that story to be shared in, and for Jesus to share in the story, and Jesus to share in his life. And I think youth ministry at its core, in a successful youth ministry, is one that asks young people, how long? And invites them to share how long, and for us to share how long. How long? For a lifetime or more. How long? Forever. How long? Just for a week. But to have to share in that becomes, I think, a significant mark of what success would be.